Thomas became Brother Marcus's apprentice, thinking he would learn to heal the sick and serve God during the Black Death. What he didn't know was that plague doctor apprentices were expected to taste patients' urine to diagnose different stages of plague, inhale mercury vapor daily to purify their lungs from evil humors, and sleep in beds with plague victims to test whether treatments actually worked. Because in medieval medicine, learning to heal meant accepting that you would probably die in the process. Welcome to Whispers of History. Before we begin this incredible story of Thomas, whose dreams of becoming a holy healer during the Black Death taught him that medieval medicine was built on the belief that only those willing to embrace death could fight it, tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. And if you believe that sometimes the greatest courage is found in the darkest places, hit that subscribe button and share this story to help us honor those who faced humanity's deadliest pandemic with nothing but faith and fatal remedies. The year was 1348, and death walked through Europe like a harvest angel, cutting down rich and poor, young and old, holy and sinful with equal indifference. The Black Death had arrived in England on ships from the continent, carried in the bellies of rats and the blood of fleas, and within months entire villages had been reduced to empty houses and overgrown fields where no one remained to tend the crops. Thomas of Winchester was 17 years old when he first heard Brother Marcus preach about the sacred duty of healing during times of plague. Standing in the village square, surrounded by the smell of burning bodies and the sound of constant prayer, the monk's words cut through the despair like a beacon of hope in the darkness that had consumed the known world. God sends trials to test our faith, Brother Marcus declared, his voice carrying clearly despite the crude leather mask that covered the lower half of his face. But he also sends healers to tend his flock. Those brave enough to answer this calling will learn the sacred arts of medicine, will serve the Almighty in his most desperate hour, and will find their place in heaven assured. Thomas felt something stir in his chest as he listened to these words. He had watched his own parents die 3 weeks earlier, had seen his younger sister waste away despite his desperate prayers, had felt the horrible helplessness that came from being unable to do anything but hold the hands of the dying and promise them that their suffering would end soon. The idea that he could learn to actually help people, to fight against the plague rather than simply endure it, filled him with a purpose he had never experienced before. After the sermon, Thomas approached Brother Marcus with the respectful deference that his village upbringing had taught him to show to men of God. The monk was tall and thin, made even more imposing by the strange leather garments he wore and the long, bird-like beak that protruded from his face. Up close, Thomas could see that the man's eyes were yellowed and bloodshot, with dark circles underneath that spoke of sleepless nights and constant exposure to suffering. "Brother," Thomas said, removing his cap and bowing his head, "I wish to serve God as you do. I wish to learn the healing arts and help fight this terrible plague that has taken so many souls." Brother Marcus studied the young man for a long moment, his gaze taking in Thomas's sturdy frame, his clear eyes, and the earnest expression that marked him as someone who still believed that good could triumph over evil through faith and determination. "Do you understand what you are asking, boy?" the monk replied, his voice muffled by the leather mask, but still carrying an undertone of something that might have been sadness. "Do you comprehend what it means to serve God as a healer during these dark times?" "I believe so, brother," Thomas answered. "I wish to learn to cure the sick, to ease suffering, to serve God by helping his people in their greatest hour of need." Brother Marcus was quiet for several seconds, and Thomas thought he heard the man sigh beneath his mask. When the monk spoke again, his voice was gentler but also somehow more serious. "What you speak of is noble, boy, but it is not what I offer. What I offer is the chance to serve God by learning to understand death itself, to work so closely with the plague that you become part of it, to sacrifice your own health, and probably your life in the pursuit of knowledge that might, if God wills it, Someday help others survive what you will not. The word should have been discouraging, but instead Thomas felt his resolve strengthen. He had already lost everything that mattered to him in this life. His family was dead, his village was dying, and the world he had known since childhood was crumbling around him. The idea that his own death might serve a greater purpose, might contribute to some future victory over the plague, seemed like the only meaning left in a universe gone mad. "I understand, brother," he said firmly. "I accept whatever God requires of me." Brother Marcus nodded slowly, as if he had expected this response, but still found it troubling. "Very well. But understand this clearly, Thomas of Winchester. Once you begin training as a plague doctor's apprentice, there is no turning back. The knowledge you will gain will change you. The practices you will learn will mark you, and the work you will do will almost certainly kill you. If you have any doubts, any reservations, any hope of living a normal life, express them now or hold your peace forever." Thomas looked around at the devastated village that had once been his home, at the smoke rising from the pits where bodies were burned day and night, at the faces of the few survivors who walked like ghosts through streets littered with the debris of collapsed lives. Normal life was already over. The only question was whether his death would serve some purpose or simply be another meaningless casualty in a war against an enemy that could not be fought with conventional weapons. "I have no doubts, brother," he said. "When do we begin?" Brother Marcus smiled, though the expression was hidden behind his mask. "We begin now, boy, and may God have mercy on both our souls." Brother Marcus's house stood at the edge of what had once been the prosperous town of Salisbury, but which now resembled a charnel house more than a place where living people had once conducted normal lives. The building itself was larger than Thomas had expected, with thick stone walls and small windows that had been sealed with oiled leather to keep out what the monk called corrupted air. Smoke rose constantly from the chimney, and the smell that surrounded the place was unlike anything Thomas had ever encountered, a mixture of burning herbs, chemical vapors, and something else that made his stomach turn. "Welcome to your new home," Brother Marcus said as they approached the heavy wooden door. "I must warn you that the sights and smells within may disturb you at first, but you will become accustomed to them in time. Everything we do here serves the purpose of understanding and combating the plague, even when it may seem unusual." The interior of the house was dimly lit by oil lamps and filled with apparatus that Thomas could not immediately identify. Tables lined the walls, covered with strange instruments, bottles of colored liquids, and what appeared to be samples of various substances in clay vessels. The air was thick with smoke from burning materials that produced acrid vapors, and Thomas had to cover his nose and mouth to avoid coughing. "Your education begins immediately," Brother Marcus said, leading Thomas to a table where several clay cups had been arranged in a neat row. "The first thing you must learn is that the body reveals its secrets through examination of its products. A skilled plague doctor can determine the stage and severity of the disease by careful analysis of what the patient's body produces." Thomas looked at the cups with growing unease. They contained liquids in various shades of yellow and brown, some clear and others cloudy, all giving off odors that made him want to step away from the table. "These samples were collected this morning from patients in different stages of plague infection," Brother Marcus continued, his tone matter-of-fact despite the horrifying nature of what he was describing. "Your task is to taste each one and learn to identify the characteristics that indicate the progression of the disease." "Taste them?" Thomas asked, certain he had misunderstood. "Yes. Urine is one of the most reliable indicators of the body's condition. A plague doctor must be able to taste urine and immediately know whether the patient is in the early stages of infection, suffering from the bubonic form of the disease, or dying from the pneumonic variety. Each stage has its own distinct taste, and learning to identify these differences can mean the difference between effective treatment and wasted effort." The monk picked up one of the cups and held it toward Thomas. This sample came from a patient who was infected 3 days ago. The plague is just beginning to establish itself in his system. Taste it and tell me what you observe. Thomas stared at the cup, his mind reeling. This was not what he had expected when he volunteered to learn the healing arts. He had imagined himself learning to prepare herbal remedies, perhaps assisting with surgery or helping to comfort the dying. The idea of drinking the urine of plague victims had never entered his mind, and every instinct in his body recoiled from the prospect. I don't understand how this helps heal people," he said weakly. "Healing begins with understanding," Brother Marcus replied patiently. "We cannot treat what we do not comprehend. The plague affects different patients in different ways, and the only way to determine the appropriate treatment is through careful examination of the patient's condition. Urine provides information that cannot be obtained through any other means." The explanation was logical, but it did nothing to make the prospect less revolting. Thomas took the cup with trembling hands and raised it to his lips. The smell alone was enough to make him gag, but he forced himself to take a small sip. The taste was indescribable. Bitter, salty, with an underlying metallic flavor that seemed to coat his tongue and throat. He fought down the urge to vomit and tried to focus on Brother Marcus's instructions about identifying specific characteristics. "Good," the monk said as Thomas forced himself to swallow. "Now, what did you observe? Was it sweet or bitter? Clear or cloudy? What color was it, and how did it smell?" Thomas struggled to form coherent thoughts through his revulsion. It was bitter, very bitter, and it smelled like... He paused, trying to find words for something so far outside normal human experience. Like metal and decay. Excellent. That bitterness indicates that the patient's kidneys are beginning to struggle with the infection. The metallic taste suggests that there is blood in the urine, which is common in the early stages of plague. Now try the second sample. For the next hour, Thomas forced himself to taste samples from patients in various stages of plague infection. Each one was worse than the last, with flavors that ranged from unbearably sweet to so foul that he had to run outside twice to vomit in the yard. Brother Marcus observed his reactions with clinical detachment, taking notes and offering commentary on the significance of each taste and smell. The sweet samples come from patients whose bodies are beginning to shut down, the monk explained as Thomas struggled to recover from a particularly horrifying specimen. When the kidneys fail, sugar accumulates in the urine, creating a sickly sweet taste that indicates the patient has perhaps days to live. The foul-smelling samples, on the other hand, indicate secondary infections that have developed as the plague weakens the patient's ability to fight disease. By the end of the lesson, Thomas felt fundamentally changed. The act of deliberately consuming the bodily waste of plague victims had crossed a line in his mind that he had not even known existed. He had moved from the world of normal human experience into something that felt alien and nightmarish. "Why?" he asked as they concluded the session. "Why must we do this? Surely there are other ways to determine a patient's condition." Brother Marcus was quiet for a moment before answering. "There are other methods, yes, but they are less reliable, and in dealing with the plague, unreliable information kills people. More importantly, this exercise serves another purpose. It begins the process of separating you from normal human reactions and limitations." "What do you mean?" "A plague doctor must be able to do things that ordinary people cannot do, must think thoughts that ordinary people cannot think, must accept realities that ordinary people cannot accept. If you cannot drink the urine of plague victims, how will you handle the other requirements of this profession? How will you cope with the treatments we must administer, the experiments we must conduct, the sacrifices we must make?" Thomas was beginning to understand that his apprenticeship was not just about learning medical techniques. It was about transformation, about becoming something other than a normal human being. The realization was terrifying, but it was also strangely liberating. If he was going to die anyway, if the world was ending around him, then perhaps it was better to die as something more than just another helpless victim. "What happens next?" he asked. Brother Marcus smiled behind his mask. "Next, we begin your introduction to mercury therapy. But first, you should know that after today, your sense of taste will never be quite the same. The things you have consumed will remain with you, will change how you experience food and drink for the rest of your life. Consider it your first permanent mark as a plague doctor's apprentice." As Thomas laid down that night on a straw pallet in Brother Marcus's house, he could still taste the bitter, metallic flavors of plague victims' urine coating his mouth and throat. He realized that the monk had been right. He was already changing, already becoming something different from the young man who had volunteered to serve God just hours earlier. The question was whether he would survive the transformation long enough to serve any useful purpose, or whether the process of becoming a plague doctor would kill him before he could help anyone else. The second week of Thomas's apprenticeship began with an introduction to what Brother Marcus called the purification of the blood and lungs through divine mercury. Thomas had heard of mercury before. The liquid metal was sometimes used by alchemists and was rumored to have magical properties, but he had never imagined that it would play a central role in plague treatment. "Mercury is the most sacred of all medicines," Brother Marcus explained as he led Thomas to a small chamber at the back of the house that had been set up as a laboratory. "It is liquid like blood, silvery like the moon, and it moves with its own mysterious life. When properly administered, it drives evil humors from the body and purifies the patient's essence." The chamber was filled with apparatus that looked more like torture devices than medical equipment. A large bronze vessel sat over a fire, with tubes leading from its lid to a series of smaller containers. The air was thick with vapors that made Thomas's eyes water and his throat burn. "Today you will begin taking mercury treatment yourself," the monk continued. "This serves two purposes. First, it will purify your own body and protect you from plague infection. Second, it will allow you to understand the effects of the treatment so that you can better help patients who are undergoing mercury therapy." Brother Marcus led Thomas to a wooden chair positioned directly in front of the bronze vessel. "Sit here and breathe deeply. The vapors from the heated mercury will enter your lungs and begin the purification process. At first, you may experience some discomfort, but this is normal and indicates that the treatment is working." Thomas sat down and immediately began to feel the effects of the mercury vapors. His throat began to burn, his eyes watered uncontrollably, and he felt a strange metallic taste spreading through his mouth. Within minutes, he was coughing violently and struggling to catch his breath. "This is normal," Brother Marcus assured him. "The mercury is driving evil humors from your lungs. Continue breathing normally, and the discomfort will pass." But the discomfort did not pass. As the minutes stretched on, Thomas felt increasingly ill. His head began to pound, his hands started to shake, and he felt as though his entire body was being poisoned from within. When he tried to speak, his words came out slurred and unclear. "Brother," he managed to say through his coughing, "I feel very sick. Perhaps we should stop." "Nonsense," the monk replied firmly. "The sickness you feel is the mercury doing its work. If we stop now, the evil humors will settle back into your system, and you will be more vulnerable to plague than before. You must endure the treatment for at least 1 hour to receive its full benefit." The hour that followed was one of the longest of Thomas's life. The mercury vapors continued to burn his throat and lungs, making each breath a struggle. His hands shook so violently that he could not hold them still, and his vision began to blur. By the time Brother Marcus finally allowed him to leave the chair, he could barely walk. "Excellent," the monk said, helping Thomas to a nearby bench. "You have completed your first mercury treatment successfully. The shaking and confusion you are experiencing are normal side effects that will diminish as your body adapts to the medicine. How often must I do this? Thomas asked, his voice barely recognizable due to the damage the vapors had done to his throat. Daily at first. Once your body has been properly purified, we can reduce the frequency to every few days. But you must understand that mercury treatment is not something you do temporarily. It becomes a permanent part of your life, a constant process of purification that maintains your ability to work with plague patients without becoming infected yourself. Over the following days, Thomas learned that mercury treatment was indeed a daily reality for plague doctors. Each morning, he was required to spend an hour breathing mercury vapors, and each evening, he was given a cup of wine mixed with liquid mercury to drink. The effects were cumulative and devastating. Within a week, his hand shook constantly, making it difficult to perform even simple tasks. His speech became slurred and difficult to understand. His teeth began to loosen in his gums, and his gums themselves became inflamed and painful. Most disturbing of all, he began to experience periods of confusion and memory loss, as if parts of his mind were simply disappearing. These effects are temporary, Brother Marcus assured him when Thomas expressed concern about his deteriorating condition. Your body is adjusting to the presence of divine mercury in your system. Once the adjustment is complete, you will find that you have greater resistance to disease and enhanced ability to perceive the spiritual aspects of illness. But Thomas was beginning to suspect that the effects were not temporary at all. He observed that Brother Marcus himself displayed all the same symptoms: the shaking hands, the slurred speech, the yellowed eyes, the periods of confusion. The monk had clearly been taking mercury treatments for years, and the cumulative damage was evident in his every movement and word. "Brother," Thomas asked one evening as they prepared the next day's mercury treatments, "how long have you been taking these medicines?" 7 years, Brother Marcus replied without hesitation. "I began when the plague first reached England, and I have continued daily treatments ever since. It is the only reason I have been able to work so closely with plague patients without becoming infected." "And do you feel that the treatments have affected your health?" The monk paused in his work and looked at Thomas with eyes that were clearly struggling to focus. "The mercury has changed me, yes, but it has changed me in ways that allow me to serve God more effectively. I am no longer entirely human, but I am no longer entirely vulnerable to human diseases either. I exist in a state between life and death, between health and sickness, and from that position I can help others in ways that a normal man could not." The explanation was both fascinating and terrifying. Thomas was beginning to understand that becoming a plague doctor meant accepting a kind of living death, a gradual poisoning that would eventually destroy his body and mind, but which supposedly provided protection against the plague in the meantime. The question was whether the protection was real or simply a delusion created by minds that had been damaged by years of mercury poisoning. As his own symptoms worsened, Thomas found it increasingly difficult to think clearly enough to evaluate the evidence. What he did know was that he was committed now. The mercury treatments had already begun to change him in ways that could not be reversed. His body was becoming adapted to the presence of the poison, and stopping the treatments suddenly could be fatal. He was trapped in a cycle of gradual self-destruction that he had entered voluntarily, but could no longer escape. He was becoming a plague doctor, and a plague doctor, as Brother Marcus had warned him, was something less than human and more than mortal. Whether that transformation would ultimately serve any useful purpose remained to be seen. 3 weeks into his apprenticeship, Thomas faced what Brother Marcus called the ultimate test of a plague doctor's commitment to serving God and understanding disease. It came in the form of a direct order that challenged everything Thomas had believed about medicine, healing, and basic human decency. "Tonight," Brother Marcus announced as they finished preparing mercury vapors for their evening treatments, "you will sleep in the plague house with active patients. This is necessary for several reasons. First, it will allow you to observe the progression of the disease during nighttime hours when symptoms often worsen. Second, it will test whether the mercury treatments have successfully protected you from infection. Third, it will complete your psychological preparation for the work ahead. Thomas stared at the monk in disbelief. You want me to sleep in beds with plague victims? Not just sleep with them, Brother Marcus clarified. You will share their beds, breathe their air, come into contact with their bodily fluids, and monitor their conditions throughout the night. By morning, we will know whether you are truly protected by mercury purification or whether you will join them as a patient. The plague house was a large building that had once served as an inn for travelers, but which had been converted into a place where the dying could be housed together away from healthy populations. Thomas had visited it several times during his training, but always wearing protective gear and maintaining careful distance from the patients. The idea of spending the night there without protection was absolutely terrifying. What if I become infected? He asked. Then you will die, Brother Marcus replied matter-of-factly, but you will die in service to God and medical knowledge. Your death will provide valuable information about the effectiveness of mercury treatment, and your suffering will bring you closer to understanding the experiences of those you seek to help. The logic was insane, but Thomas had already learned that plague doctor training operated according to principles that normal human reasoning could not comprehend. He had drunk the urine of plague victims, poisoned himself daily with mercury vapors, and accepted that his life expectancy was probably measured in months rather than years. Spending one night in direct contact with plague patients was simply the next step in a journey that had already taken him far beyond normal human experience. That evening, as the sun set over the devastated landscape of plague-ravaged England, Thomas entered the plague house, carrying nothing but a thin blanket and his increasingly uncertain faith in God's protection. The building reeked of death and decay, filled with the sounds of coughing, moaning, and the prayers of people who knew they were dying. Brother Marcus led him to a room where 3 patients lay in various stages of plague infection. The first was a middle-aged woman whose body was covered with the characteristic black swellings called buboes. She was conscious but delirious, muttering constantly about flames and demons. The second was a young man who appeared to be sleeping, but whose breathing was so labored that each breath sounded like it might be his last. The third was an elderly priest who had apparently contracted the pneumonic form of the plague and was coughing up blood with such violence that the walls around his bed were spattered with red. "You will sleep here tonight," Brother Marcus said, indicating a narrow space between the beds. "Do not attempt to treat the patients. That is not the purpose of this exercise. Simply observe, take mental notes, and see what God reveals to you about the nature of suffering and disease." As the monk left him alone with the dying patients, Thomas realized that this was more than just a medical test. It was a spiritual ordeal designed to break down his remaining attachment to normal human concerns like personal safety and self-preservation. A man who could sleep peacefully surrounded by plague victims was a man who had transcended ordinary fears and limitations. The night that followed was a journey through hell. The woman with buboes spent hours screaming about visions of demons and flames, her ravings so vivid and terrifying that Thomas began to wonder if the plague actually did open doorways to supernatural realms. The young man's breathing became increasingly irregular, with long periods of silence followed by sudden, desperate gasps for air. The priest continued coughing up blood until Thomas was literally lying in a pool of infected bodily fluids. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the experience was that Thomas found himself becoming accustomed to it. After the first few hours of horror and revulsion, he began to observe the patient's symptoms with clinical detachment. He noted the progression of their disease, the timing of their worst symptoms, the ways their bodies responded to different stages of infection. He was learning to see human suffering as data rather than tragedy. By morning, 2 of the 3 patients were dead. The woman with buboes had died during a particularly violent seizure around midnight. The young man had simply stopped breathing sometime before dawn. Only the priest survived, though he was clearly close to death and unlikely to last another day. When Brother Marcus returned to collect him, Thomas realized that he felt no sadness about the deaths he had witnessed. The mercury treatments and psychological conditioning had done their work. He was becoming capable of viewing human death as simply another natural phenomenon to be observed and understood. "How do you feel?" Brother Marcus asked as they walked away from the plague house. "Different," Thomas replied honestly. "I watched 2 people die last night, and I feel nothing. No grief, no horror, no fear. Is that normal?" "It is necessary," the monk answered. "A plague doctor who grieves for every patient he loses will go mad within weeks. You must learn to see death as part of God's plan, suffering as information, and human life as temporary and ultimately insignificant compared to the knowledge that can be gained from studying disease." Thomas nodded, understanding that another fundamental change had occurred within him. He was no longer entirely human in his emotional responses. The combination of mercury poisoning and psychological conditioning had created something new, a being capable of functioning in environments and situations that would destroy a normal person's sanity. Whether this transformation was progress or degradation was a question he no longer felt capable of answering. What mattered was that he had survived the test and proven himself ready for the next stage of his training. The question was what that next stage would demand of him, and whether any recognizable part of his original self would survive the process. After 2 months of training, Brother Marcus announced that Thomas was ready for the final stage of his education as a plague doctor's apprentice. This involved what the monk called participating in experimental treatments that advance our understanding of the disease while testing the limits of human endurance. The experimental treatments were based on a medieval medical theory that diseases could be fought by deliberately introducing controlled amounts of the same disease into healthy subjects. The logic was that a person who survived a mild case of plague would be immune to more severe infections, similar to the way that people who survived smallpox were protected from future outbreaks. Today you will deliberately infect yourself with plague material collected from patients in the early stages of the disease, Brother Marcus explained as he prepared a syringe filled with dark fluid that Thomas preferred not to examine too closely. The mercury treatments you have been receiving should provide sufficient protection to prevent the infection from becoming fatal, while allowing you to experience the disease firsthand. The idea was so insane that Thomas initially thought he had misunderstood. "You want me to give myself the plague?" "A controlled version of the plague, yes. This will serve multiple purposes. It will test the effectiveness of mercury protection, provide you with direct experience of the disease's progression, and possibly grant you immunity that will allow you to work more closely with patients in the future." Thomas realized that this was the logical endpoint of everything that had come before. If he was going to become a plague doctor, he needed to understand the disease, not just from observation, but from personal experience. The mercury treatments had supposedly prepared his body to survive controlled infection. All that remained was to test whether the theory worked in practice. The injection itself was surprisingly anticlimactic. Brother Marcus used a crude syringe to introduce the infected material directly into Thomas's bloodstream, then sat back to observe the results. For the first few hours, nothing happened. Thomas began to hope that perhaps the mercury treatments had made him completely immune to infection. Then the fever began. What followed was 3 days of the most intense suffering Thomas had ever experienced. The plague infection, even in its supposedly controlled form, attacked his body with vicious efficiency. Buboes developed in his armpits and groin, swelling until they felt like burning coals pressed against his skin. Fever consumed him, causing hallucinations that were so vivid he could not distinguish them from reality. His lungs filled with fluid, making each breath a struggle against drowning, but he did not die. The mercury treatments, whatever their other effects, seemed to provide just enough protection to keep the infection from becoming fatal. He experienced every symptom of the plague, understood every stage of its progression, felt every agony that his future patients would endure, but his body managed to fight off the disease just before it would have killed him. The recovery was almost as terrible as the illness itself. For weeks afterward, he felt weak and confused, his body struggling to repair the damage that the infection had caused. But gradually, he began to feel stronger than before, as if surviving the plague had indeed granted him some form of immunity. "Excellent," Brother Marcus said when Thomas was finally able to resume his duties. "You have now experienced the plague from both perspectives, as observer and as victim. This knowledge will make you uniquely qualified to treat future patients, because you will understand their suffering in ways that no other healer can." Thomas had indeed been transformed by the experience, but not in ways that he had expected. The combination of mercury poisoning, psychological conditioning, and deliberate infection had created something that was no longer entirely human. He could work with plague patients without fear, could observe their suffering without emotional response, could make medical decisions based on cold calculation rather than sympathy or hope. He had become what Brother Marcus had promised, a plague doctor capable of functioning in circumstances that would destroy ordinary men. But the price had been everything that had once made him recognizably human. As winter approached, and the plague continued its relentless advance across England, Thomas began his work as a fully qualified plague doctor's apprentice. He moved through villages and towns like a figure from a nightmare, wearing the characteristic birdbeak mask and leather garments, carrying with him the tools and knowledge that marked him as someone who had chosen to embrace death in order to fight it. The treatments he administered were largely ineffective. Medieval medicine had no real weapons against the plague, but his presence provided something that was almost as valuable, the comfort of knowing that someone cared enough to try. Even when trying was probably futile, most of his patients died despite his efforts. But a few survived, and Thomas told himself that those few lives justified everything he had endured and everything he had become. Whether this was true or simply a necessary delusion was a question he no longer allowed himself to consider. He had learned to taste urine, breathe poison, sleep with the dying, and infect himself with deadly disease. He had sacrificed his health, his sanity, and his humanity in pursuit of knowledge that might help others survive what he probably would not. He had become a plague doctor, and a plague doctor was something that existed in the space between life and death, between hope and despair, between healing and harm. It was a role that required giving up everything human in order to serve humanity, and Thomas had paid that price willingly. Whether it had been worth paying was a judgment that only God could make.